Hey guys, so I was super lucky and I got to play Dark Souls 3 today. I got about 4 or 5 hours with this demo build that's going around Gamescom, and I played it with the sole intention of getting a feel for exactly what is different, what is new, and what you need to know about the game, so let me tell you all about it. The demo took place on the Wall of Lodoleth, which apparently has recently been under attack. It was filled with hollows and dragons and the corpses of knights and the occasional undead knight. These are pretty standard enemies for an early Souls game level, and I expect this to be an early level in the game. Level design was compact and really vertical in the sense that there were a lot of ledge drops and walking on rooftops, ladders, elevators, and a ton of unlockable shortcuts as well. But this is all standard stuff for a Souls game, so let's talk combat. The newest addition to combat is the weapon art mechanic. Basically, a weapon art is activated with L2, and it's a mode that, once entered, gives you access to a new set of moves based on your weapon. So, for example, imagine that you have a shield in your left hand and a straight sword in your right. When you hold down L2, your shield will go on your back, and your character will hold the short sword out in front of him, indicating that you are now in a weapon art stance. While you are in this weapon art stance, your R1 and R2 bumpers no longer do their standard attacks. Instead, a stanced R1 does this uppercut that is intended to break an opponent's guard. Stanced R2 makes your character dash forward towards your target and then stab at the end of the run. So these are weapon arts for the short sword, but every weapon is different. With the great sword, pressing L2 doesn't put you into a stance, rather it slams the hilt of your sword down vertically in front of you, and from here you can press R2 to do a massive uppercut that will send your opponent flying. So the great sword weapon art is more of a combo. During this uppercut attack you cannot be staggered, so it was wonderful against heavily armored enemies. But there is no weapon art R1 with the great sword, unlike the short sword that had weapon art R1s and R2s. To give you more examples, with the Legion scimitars, there didn't appear to be any weapon art combo. Rather, you would press L2 and your character would spin with both of the blades. It had a great cleave effect that was wonderful for multiple enemies. With the battle axe weapon, again, there wasn't a weapon art combo for this weapon. Instead, when you pressed L2, your character did a battle cry that knocked the enemy back, and after this, your weapon glowed red and I believe it made you deal additional damage, kind of like an enrage effect that lasted for a little while. But if you're confused, and I understand if you are, the takeaway for what a weapon art is that it's a way for your weapon to have unique properties or moves granted to it by the pressing or holding down of L2, and it's as simple as that. Every time you use one of these weapon art techniques with L2, you use up what I'm going to call weapon art points, for lack of a better name. In the top left, our character started with 20 of these points. They were displayed just below the Covenant marker, which was the Sunlight Covenant, by the way, praise the sun. So these points were used up whenever you used a weapon art technique. Some techniques used more points than others. The greatsword used 4. 1 for the initial slam, and 3 for the uppercut. The short sword attacks used 1 point each, the battle axe used 2 points, and the scimitar spin used 1. When you ran out of points, these weapon art techniques did less damage. For example, my short sword attack did 138 damage when I had a weapon art point, and 98 damage when I had no points remaining. And as far as I know, the only way to replenish these points was at the bonfire. Whether you could use weapon arts at all was actually designated by the type of shield you used. There were 2 types of shield in the demo. There were parrying small shields and weapon art medium shields. They had a little symbol on them which signified whether it was a parry shield or whether it was a weapon art shield. If you had a parry shield, L2 was parry instead of a weapon art, just like in all the previous games. And parrying is back in true Dark Souls 1 style. In Dark Souls 1, you had to press parry as soon as an attack connected with your shield. After this, the enemy's attacking arm was flung back and you would stab them in the gut with a riposte. In Dark Souls 2, you had to press parry slightly before the attack hit you, and then the enemy was knocked flat on their back. In Dark Souls 3, it's like it was in Dark Souls 1. There's a small parry window, and you have to press parry at the exact same time the attack connects with you. I'd say that it's still slightly harder to parry than it was in Dark Souls 1 though, mainly because enemies appeared to attack a little bit faster, and an increase in speed is a good way to describe the demo in general. The Souls series has always been about being cautious and being tactical. You're encouraged to hide behind your shield and manage your stamina really well and try to find a gap in your enemy's defenses. Bloodborne broke the mold a little bit. It encouraged a proactive method to your gameplay, where you were the aggressive one and an enemy had to respond to you, not the other way round. Dark Souls 3, on the other hand, stays true to those Souls series roots. You play responsively and carefully, so it's not like Bloodborne, but it's not quite as slow as previous Souls games, if that makes sense. For example, rolling was really fast. We were clad in really heavy plate, and we rolled around like it didn't matter. It was like the roll in Bloodborne or the fast roll of previous Souls games. To counter this, enemies also seem to attack slightly faster. Hollows in particular attack in frenzies and are difficult to predict, and all of the knight characters we fought had shield bash attacks that were intended to punish super defensive players. And I've been playing Bloodborne so much that I just initially rolled around and didn't use my shield, but you get punished for playing that way. After a few hours of play, I was back to relying on my shield again. There was a medium shield that one character had that was like the Drangleic shield from Dark Souls 2, in that it blocked 100% physical damage, and the parry shield blocked about 60% physical damage. So it sounds like the parry shield is especially for pro players, to be honest, since you're missing out on all those power stance attacks. And I gotta tell you, it feels good to be playing a Souls game again instead of Bloodborne. You're creeping around these levels, and you're constantly keeping your shield up because there are a ton of ambush moments in this demo. Enemies jumped at you from behind barrels, they played dead, then crept up behind you, and they're also coming at you over railings. If you don't have your shield up at all times, you're gonna get hit, and getting hit matters in this game. It's not like Bloodborne where you can replenish your health by hitting them back. It's not like Dark Souls 2 where there are life gems. Estus works like it did in Dark Souls 1, and that makes me so happy. My biggest problem with Dark Souls 2 was actually life gems. I hated how you could buy 99 and keep your health topped up constantly. There was never that threat of, oh shit, I just ran out of Estus and now I have to find the bonfire as soon as possible. You know? In Dark Souls 3, carelessly getting hit means that you have to top yourself up with Estus, and it means that things get really exciting when you have no Estus left, and you have a bunch of souls you don't want to lose, but you just want to push a little bit further to find that bonfire. I miss that feeling so much, and I sincerely hope they don't bring back life gems, and I don't think they will. When you chug your Estus, it's like Dark Souls 1 as well. The heal from the Estus is incredibly quick, just like you see here on the screen. It activates quickly, and the health replenishes instantly. What's different is what happens after the health replenishes. Your character stands idle for a good half a second after the chug, during which you can't move, and you're quite susceptible to damage. I've slowed it down on screen to show you what it was like. So it's interesting, because while you have Estus, it's easy to stay alive, but you had better make sure you chug your Estus in a good spot, because if you don't, an enemy will be easily able to hit you after you chug your Estus and punish you. It's like Dark Souls 1 in so many ways. Let's go down the list. We've talked about parries, we've talked about Estus, let's talk about backstabs. They're like Dark Souls 1 as well, and I know that might make a lot of you groan. As soon as you position yourself behind an enemy, you can tap R1 to lock them into a backstab animation. The bad news is, a lot of the enemies I faced were able to be taken down with backstabs. The good news is, the window for backstabs seems to be slightly smaller, and enemies are much better at avoiding backstabs than they were in Dark Souls 1. If you backstab fish a hollow, it's easy. They're a hollow, they have clumsy movements, and it's easy to take one out with a backstab. But if you attempt to backstab a knight, you'll have a much harder time. They're trained to avoid it. They try to face you at all times, and they even have specific moves intended to catch backstab fishes. The shielded knights would often swing their shield back over their shoulder to hit you, and had a bunch of shield bash attacks to keep you away. That said, all it took was a well-timed roll or strafe through an enemy combo to catch them in a backstab, so it's my impression that for a one-on-one fight, on average, you'll perform at least one backstab, because they're quite common and easy for a good player to pull off. One thing I'm glad is back from Dark Souls 2 is directional rolling while you're locked on, and you really do have to aim a lot of your dodges well, because I noticed that enemies seem to have a smarter AI in the way that they surround you. I would run past a mob of enemies, and when they caught up with me, they wouldn't just attack, they would huddle around me and catch me in a corner to stop me running away. Oh, and another cool thing that they've added is charge R2 attacks similar to Bloodborne. Holding down R2 allows you to charge an attack for a few seconds longer, which adds damage and stagger to your attack when you finally do let it go. Unlike in Bloodborne, there's no visual or audio cue to the charging attack, but they're definitely there and it's definitely powerful. But in Dark Souls 3, there aren't as many moveset options as there were in Bloodborne, for example. In Bloodborne you had running R2s, backstep attacks were different, but in Dark Souls 3, it's more like previous Souls games. The only things that I noticed that were different was that your running R2 is now a jump attack animation, and I also noticed that you could do a running L1 attack when you two-handed the scimitars. But let's move on to story and how it was presented. So throughout the world, there were a few lore notes that you could activate. These were called Appetizers. Appetizers are the words in memory of a person who has died, and they appeared on a number of tombstones throughout the level. When you found one, it gave you the option to offer flame, and this didn't seem to take anything from your inventory, but once you did it, you could read the Appetizers. I'm going to read you the 3 that I found. The first one was, Grave of a Nameless Retainer, raised his sword for the Lord of Cinder. The second one was, this exile was chased from his homeland and haunted by a black sun. And the third one was, died in solitude, may his soul find its way back to the frigid valley. The third one was incredibly tough to get to. It was the most hidden thing in the whole demo, actually. You had to find a hidden key, and then you had to find the door it unlocked, and then you had to defeat the most difficult thing in the whole demo. No joke, this thing wasn't even a boss, but it should have been. This is him here. This Ice Knight was so tough. He attacked you relentlessly, and the fight challenged every ability you had as a player. You had to manage your stamina, you had to roll through attacks when you were low on stamina, you had to choose the perfect moment to heal, and on top of all that, this guy induced a status effect that no one has seen before. It was called Frostbite. And maybe people have seen it before. It was very similar to Bleed. So if you stood too close to the knight, your Frostbite meter would build up, and if he hit you, it would build up as well. It took about 3 or 4 hits for your meter to reach full, or perhaps about 5 or 6 seconds standing right next to him. And when the meter did reach full, you were frostbitten, which is kind of like how Bleed worked in Dark Souls 2. You now have a meter that goes down, and while it's going down, your stamina barely regenerates at all. It regenerates slowly as if you were holding your shield up. If you got frostbitten, it pretty much meant instant death in this fight, because this enemy was totally relentless. He also took about 20 scimitar hits to kill, and it was really fun. It took me about 3 or 4 tries to kill him, which is what I categorize as fun. Anyway, I kinda made that sound like a boss fight, but it wasn't. It was just an enemy. The boss fight was actually way easier. She was called the Dancer of the Frigid Wastes, and you see her in the trailer. The most difficult part about this fight was anticipating attacks, because she had this really flowing moveset that was pretty hard to dodge. I got her on my second try, no problems at all. Maybe she'll be harder in the final game, but that's the thing. We'll have to wait and see before we can judge any difficulty, because so much is subject to change from a demo. And there's probably a lot of other little things I could talk about, but I'm pretty sure this is most of the important stuff. If I haven't mentioned it in this video, it's probably because it wasn't very interesting or different from previous games. For example, there were throwing knives, divine blessings, fire bombs, charcoal pine resin, and green blossoms in the demo. There were torches too, except these torches never run out, similar to Bloodborne. The enemies in the demo were hollows, hollow with shield, hollow with crossbow, hollow with knives, ninja hollows, a taller hollow with an axe, a taller hollow with a sword, and there were also demon dogs, like in Bloodborne. Then there were hollows that turned into writhing black masses, There was a fat knight that used AoE magic, which was a little different, and then there were hollows with lanterns that swung it around and aggroed all the passive hollows around her. In terms of knights, there were knights with long swords and a shield, and there was a knight with a spear and a great shield, and there was also the ice knight I mentioned before, and a dragon that breathed fire over the pathway you needed to cross, which is a Miyazaki favorite, so a very standard first Dark Souls level. But in true From Software fashion, there's no B-roll for me to currently share, so make sure you're subscribed so I can show you some more gameplay as soon as it surfaces, and also make sure you check out the channels of other Souls uploaders who got their hands on the game. As far as I know, Peeve Peeverson, Dreaded Cone, Lobos Jr., Terramantis, Sunlight Blade, Oroboro the Ninja, and Barneezy have all played this game, so I'll update the description with any content from those guys. I'm sure they got some info that I missed, and I'd really appreciate it if you guys checked out their channels and supported their content as well. But other than that, thank you for watching this video, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye bye.